Good morning. Welcome to episode 113 of the Driller Newscast, a weekly update on the news and stories impacting the drilling, construction, geothermal, and water industry. I'm your host, Brock Yorty. This week in the news, the Department of Interior released $242 million for 5 water storage projects in the Western U.S. Next, the White House is requesting feedback by July 1st for the advancement of water conservation. And this is in consideration of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. For a feature this week, we're going to talk upper and lower basin state alternative proposals to the Bureau of Reclamation for the post-2026 operational guidelines for the Colorado River Basin, and how that's going to impact groundwater. We have a very busy week, so we're going to jump right into the news. My challenge, I want to know what your top 3 tailgate talks of the year were. We'll talk safety next week. This week in the news, the Department of Interior last week announced $242 million investment as part of President Biden's Investing in America agenda that will bring clean, reliable drinking water to communities across the West through 5 water storage conveyance projects. The projects in California, Colorado, and Washington are expected to add at least 1.6 million acre-feet of additional water storage capacity. That's enough to support 6.4 million people for a year. The funding will also invest in a feasibility study in Arizona that is designed to advance water storage capacity once completed. President Biden's Investing in America agenda represents the largest investment in climate resiliency in the nation's history and is providing much needed resources to enhance Western communities' resilience to drought and climate change. Through the bipartisan infrastructure law, the reclamation is investing a total of $8.3 billion over 5 years for water infrastructure projects, including rural water, water storage, conservation, conveyance, and nature-based solutions, dam safety, water purification and reuse, and desalinization. It's pretty great. One of these projects in California increases their water storage by 1.5 million acre-feet. It's a big deal as we get into the rest of this week's stories. Then, and I've been following this for a while, the Arkansas Valley Conduit in Colorado, it's creating a safe long-term water supply for 50,000 people in 39 rural communities along the Arkansas River. They need sustainable, safe water due to a source contamination from radionuclides. This $242 million will help strengthen water resiliency in the Western United States. Gotta love what our federal infrastructure law is possible of doing. Next, we're sticking with the White House this week. The Biden-Harris administration is leading action to advance water conservation across the West as climate change leads to intensify droughts throughout the region. President Biden's Investing in America agenda is delivering drought-resilient resources and protecting the Colorado River Basin for all who depend on it. More work lies ahead, especially for groundwater, which is interconnected with the surface water that these conservation efforts are preserving. I want you to see how the White House is talking about surface water and groundwater being interconnected. Pretty big, depending on the fact that the United States Supreme Court doesn't see it that way. They continue with this statement. Groundwater, which is fresh water that lies beneath Earth's surface, is part of the natural water cycle. Groundwater is a critical resource for agriculture, manufacturing, mining, energy production, and more. Groundwater supplies drinking water for half of the United States population, including nearly all the rural populations. In the Western states, especially, groundwater resources are being depleted at an alarming rate, mostly from agricultural withdrawal. The problem of groundwater depletion is when it's exaggerated by climate change and precipitation variability, many aquifers and groundwater withdrawals have outpaced natural and artificial recharge. There is a need to explore the consequences of artificial recharge and to identify successful recharge approaches that might be scaled across the country. We got the National Groundwater Association talking MAR wells all the time. We talk about ASR wells. And here we have the White House talking about what is a reliable recharge resource. Industry, we need to be talking to our representatives and making sure our voice is heard. This is a very big piece. They continue with this statement. In many parts of the country, the quality of groundwater has become so poor that it seriously impacts the health of communities that rely on it. This is especially true for farming and tribal communities with no other access to potable water. They go on to say groundwater is managed locally with best practices that vary from state to state, but there is an opportunity to develop and scale approaches to restore clean water in every community. To safeguard our future water security, food security, and economic security, we need a clear understanding of total groundwater use, recharge, and storage across the United States. Those are big words, everybody. Then we need to build on that understanding to guide the development of a national stewardship strategy for the critical resources. I want you to all get back to your state groundwater association, your groundwater professional association, and get to the National Groundwater Association and go, hey, are you seeing these statements? What are we representing? How are we doing this? I know we just had our smart groundwater policy fly-in, but this statement came out April 25th. This is a big topic, everybody. With that said, they state, following a public session of understanding groundwater, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, PCAST, has launched a working group on America's groundwater to consider the challenges and opportunities to improve our understanding and stewardship of this critical resource. PCAST looks forward to working with and learning from the efforts of the Department of Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, and other federal agencies, national and regional stakeholders, and many states and local agencies and organizations. To support the development of a report to advance government-wide action on groundwater, PCAST is collecting input from the public that addresses the following questions. How can we enhance the timely collection of data of groundwater inventory, use, recharge, and flow across the United States to gain a whole of country picture of the nation's groundwater resource? They're asking us to map it, everybody. How can we effectively model and predict changes in the inventory, recharge, and flow of groundwater in the context of overall water cycle and provide that information to stakeholders and decision makers? 3, how can we efficiently scale groundwater recharge while mitigating risks? What are those risks? What are we concerned about? That's by me personally. What are those? How can we ensure clean and safe groundwater, especially for the communities that are affected most by groundwater contamination and depletion? How can we engage with communities to successfully ensure a sustainable supply of groundwater, including for agriculture, industry, energy, human consumption, and healthy ecosystems and biodiversity? What strategies and incentives can help limit groundwater overuse? They invite written submissions from the public regarding any of these issues or questions highlighted that I just talked about. And if you think you have something you'd like to say, you need to get these things down on paper, less than 5 pages, by July 1st, 2024, and get it to PCAST at ostp.eop.gov with the subject groundwater. That's the subject line. Submissions should be no more than 5 pages long, provide actionable ideas, and not include proprietary information or any information inappropriate for public disclosure. Who's representing us? It's a big discussion, and this is going to go right into our feature. For this week's feature, we're heading back to Colorado River Basin states to start the discussion on the split between the upper and lower division states solutions for water allotment beyond 2026 operational guidelines. As we evaluate these two proposals for post 2026 operation and the long range operation of the Colorado River reservoirs, let's go back and start with some of the background information on the Colorado River Compact and the 7 basin states, which was created August 19th, 2021, and not agreed upon until the 24th of November, 1922. It stated the major purposes of this compact are to provide for equitable division and apportionment of the use of the waters of the Colorado River system, to establish the relative importance of different beneficial uses of water, to promote interstate comity, meaning mutual benefit, not like this is a giant Greek comedy, ha ha, but comedy as in mutual benefit, to remove causes of present and future controversies, and to secure the expeditious agriculture and industrial development of the Colorado River Basin, the storage of its waters, and the protection of life and property from floods. In 1922, we were talking about how to prevent damage of floods on the Colorado River. This is something that still comes up today, but I want you to think about how this has changed. To these ends, the Colorado River Basin is divided into 2 basins, and apportionment of the use of the part of the waters of the Colorado River system are made to each of them with the provisions that further equitable apportionments may be made. Remember, the upper basin and lower basin both are allotted 7.5 million acre feet for a total of 15 million acre feet. I want you to think about the size of Phoenix and Las Vegas in 1922. Phoenix was 29,053 people. Vegas, 2,034. It's unbelievable to think about. So we jump to 2008, where Phoenix is 1,579,000 people. Las Vegas is 564,910. And we have what they state as the 2007 interim guidelines. And they run from 2008 to December 31st, 2025. And this is where we are today as we're getting close to our 2025 guideline. And we are seeing these statements, these impact studies. We're seeing atmospheric rivers, we're seeing pineapple expresses, massive snowpack. It's insane for us to think about. But when this was being brought together, it was the 8th year of the worst drought conditions we've seen. And the goal for the Department of Interior was to prevent conflict over water, which was anticipated due to declining reservoir levels in Lake Mead and Lake Powell. Nobody was on TV going, hey, we just found another boat or car or suitcase full of gold. Now we jump 16 years, and many studies have been done, and drought conditions continue to impact the Western U.S. So last year in October, nearly 101 years later, the Department of the Interior issued a summary report on the development of post-2026 operational guidelines and strategies for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Remember, this is where we came out and we started talking about 4 million acre feet needed to be reduced in the lower basin states. The proposed federal action was to adopt specific guidelines and coordinate reservoir management strategies to address operation of Lake Powell and Lake Mead through their full operating range. And this is even to a point of balancing between Mead and Powell. The goal was to improve predictability to all water users and managers in the Colorado River Basin by developing and adopting objective guidelines for operation of Glen Canyon Dam, and Hoover Dam. And these operation guidelines are expecting to expire December 31st, 2025. The upper division states, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Wyoming, say their plan is one, consistent with the law of the river. Two, it reduces the risk caused by depleted storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. Remember, we have hydroelectric dams happening there. We have green energy. This is a very important thing for those depletions and storage. We were talking dead pool scenarios 2 years ago, and now we're back to pre-2018 levels. Three, they say, reflects the best available science and information, including impacts caused by climate change. This is for addressing existence imbalance between water supply and demand in the basin, which depends on storage in Lake Powell and Lake Mead. 5, operate Lake Powell and Lake Mead based on observed conditions instead of projected conditions. 6, account for all hydrogeologic shortages in which the upper basin. And they wrap up beautifully by stating the upper division states also acknowledge settled but undeveloped tribal water rights in upper basin, although those are not specifically described in the upper division alternative. The lower basin states, Arizona, California, Nevada, provided an alternative solution, which very much sounds the same as the upper, other than they have to contend with putting 1.5 million acre feet down to 2 Mexico states. They state the Colorado River system and its resources under a wide range of potential future system conditions due to changing climate consistent with the scope report will give sustainable management. The lower division also acknowledges that tribes, non-government organizations, and other stakeholders need to develop a consensus with the Bureau of Reclamation. This is where it gets dicey. The lower basin designs their alternatives to address impacts of drought and climate change through a holistic and sustainable approach to coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. With their big pieces being addressed with the structural deficit in the lower basin, which has 1.5 million acre feet allotted to Mexico. So where do we go from here? When you start thinking about achieving sustainable volume of water for the systems, both the upper division states and the lower division states have key trigger factors for water conservation. And they both have to do with major impacts to storage levels of Lake Powell and Lake Mead. And the big piece that we get into is that the lower division statement that they have invested and adopted in water management to adapt to the stress of the Colorado River systems in conjunction with Mexico. And they've stated that they have enough conservation to have raised the elevation levels by 91 feet in Lake Mead. They also stated for the lower division states, in 2023 alone, the lower basin reduced its consumptive use 5.8 million acre feet, leaving 1.7 million acre feet in the system. The lower division states want a shared reduction when the most critical system conditions occur. Alternatively, the upper basin says they will pursue voluntary, temporary, and compensated reductions of consumptive use. They have that caveat that it's their right to exercise. So here we have it. And now I want you to think about what we talked about in the news in December of 2023. The President's Council of Advisors of Science and Technology hosted an hour-and-a-half discussion. So I want you to go watch this at whitehouse.gov or YouTube. Again, search PCAST, Understanding Groundwater. Today, I want to hit on 2 major opening remarks from the PCAST, and we will continue this discussion as more pieces come out, but I want you to go watch that video. And I want to start with opening statements from Dr. Law, a professor at Columbia University and director of Columbia Water Center. He states that groundwater is the stock of water, which I think is a great analogy. He's saying that it can be depleted, that it's mineable, that as we use it as a resource, it may be finite and not replaced. He also makes the comparison between climate change and water depletion. And I think this is a great analogy because he says in groundwater stocks, what we use today, future generations will not have access to it. Just like what we continue to impact to climate change right now is going to make it increasingly harder for us to be able to reverse what's happening. And the crazy thing is he makes these analogies. We can come up with carbon alternatives. What is our water alternatives? This is a big variability when it consider that groundwater depletion and climate change are so closely hand in hand and dry. And as we see groundwater being the stock, then surface water, water that we can see in the clouds and in rain form is obtainable, but also can disappear. He states, we're finding substitutes for carbon, but there is no substitute for fresh groundwater. So I want you to consider why we just covered the Colorado River Basin states for the 7th time on the newscast. It's because the Colorado River is one of the biggest water ecosystems, feeding 40 million people, 7 states, 2 Mexican states, 5.5 million acres of farmland, and 30 tribes. Oh, and by the way, as we talk about the upper division states and the lower division states coming up with alternatives, 22 of those 30 tribes have federally been recognized with rights to a quarter of that Colorado River water. We don't talk much about that, but let's talk 15 million and let's take a quarter away from that. That's a big deal. 7 minutes into the PCAST video, Dr. Law says, we need a United States national strategy for water. We need a water use analysis for conservation, and it needs full support. He suggests we need a strategic water reserve that are mandated by federal agencies to support local, state, and we need the data systems and design analysis to evaluate them. This is talking about water on a national scale. Again, hey, call up your NGWA board members. This is a discussion we need to all be part of. He continues with national data analytics to help identify best land use strategies, considering climate, water, and strategic water reserves for the future economic development, to design incentive instruments and trans-state agreements to create benefits, not problems. The next speaker we hear from is Jay Famugeti. Dr. Jay is a professor at Arizona State University. He and his team pioneered the methods of the NASA GRACE mission. He pioneered those methods to use those satellites to estimate groundwater storage and the change of that groundwater storage from space. We're starting to see a lot of that data come out these days, and it didn't happen without the GRACE program. What's interesting about this is this first came out in April, and as I saw the PCAST last December, I started looking for groundwater data, groundwater use data. And sadly, with the exception of what the GRACE mission's been doing, Arizona State some universities. Most of the data that we refer to is from 2015 or 2019 USDA reports on irrigation, but it's still from 2015 reports. So Dr. J states groundwater is rapidly disappearing from the world's aquifers because of little or no oversight. The United States has no exception to groundwater depletion in the Central Valley and in southern half of the Ogallala aquifer, which has primarily been overpumped from irrigation, which threatens not only our water security, but our food security. Here's the big one. The disappearance of that water from the Ogallala threatens the resilience and climate adaptation capacity of the desert cities like Phoenix, where cuts to the Colorado River water will place increasing stress on the dwindling resource. Again, dwindling resource to Arizona, pumping more groundwater. The rapid pace and extensive scale of groundwater crisis has far outstripped the pace and scale of the response by the US and also the rest of the world. That came from Dr. J. He also states, we need far greater awareness of the importance of groundwater and extensive exploration and new management paradigms and policies, including a national scale, to come up with key ways to preserving groundwater for generations to come. He states this is an all hands on deck situation. What's wild about this is we talk a lot about our 2030 goals and our 2040 goals and our 2050 goals for net zero and carbon neutral. Remember, carbon neutral means for as much as we produce, it's the same amount that is released through the atmosphere or we sequester in some way. So where's our water neutral goals? For as much as we consume, we have to replace or conserve. Dr. J states most aquifers in the US and around the world, we actually do not know how much groundwater we have. The US and the rest of the world need a major exploration effort to characterize the shallow crustal water environment, including how much groundwater is there, how much is accessible, and how it is quality-wise varying in depth. He finishes with, and I love this, hey, if this was oil and gas, we'd already have all this research done. So we start thinking about the division with the 15 million acre feet we have surplus right now and where we're going to go with that and how groundwater is utilized. I want to post this picture right here, which is percent surface water versus groundwater used by states for the 7 Colorado River Basin states. Its source is the U.S. Geological Survey. The water use data is from 2010 national use. What is wild is as you look at this graph, New Mexico uses 50% surface water, 50% groundwater. And remember, last year's United States Supreme Court, in the case U.S. versus Navajo Nation, stated the nation should be acquiring readily available groundwater. Colorado is 85% surface water consumption versus 15% groundwater. Wyoming is 87% surface water versus 13% groundwater. Utah, 75% surface, 25% groundwater. Nevada, 54% surface, 46% groundwater. Arizona, 58% surface, 42% groundwater. In California, 66% surface water and 34% groundwater. California being one of the senior water rights holders and has the most house seats in the country. So you can see reservoir water needs to be maintained for dead pool, for hydroelectric production. We see these requirements. And this is 2010 data, nearly 15 years old. We've seen 9 to 12% growth in the Western United States. You know, the Bureau of Reclamation required 4 million acre feet to be cut by the lower division states. And Texas and New Mexico are fighting over water, while Mexico is requiring its 1.5 million acre feet. And simultaneously, Texas is fighting with Mexico over water in the Rio Grande. So this is where that 2026 and the next 100 years of conservation for the upper and lower basin of the Colorado River is feeding. Go watch this PCAST video on understanding groundwater and strategic reserves and the big hurdle we have greenhouse gases. It's a big way to start 6 months into the year. We got a lot to be representing ourselves through our state associations and the national associations. Go out, be part of this. Thank you for joining us for episode 113 of the Driller Newscast. Go check out thedriller.com. Lots of great content coming out. How are you representing groundwater in your community, at your state level, and your national level? It's a big piece. As we have a powerhouse like the National Groundwater Association, who is the groundwater kingpins, they ought to be right in the middle of this helping. And I know our great board members and our executive director and CEO, the whole crew is out there doing this. So where are your priorities right now? It ought to be on this groundwater legislation. Cheers, everybody.